This movie is about error checking. We're going to begin by having Excel find the errors that are on our worksheet, and we're going to select an error and then trace the origin of that error. And we'll talk briefly about circular references because that's another error that you may run into. We're going to talk about error checking. There's some error checking functionality on the Formulas tab in the Formula Auditing group. It's right here. It says Error Checking. Left-clicking it, Excel searches the worksheet beginning with the active cell, which was B3, and shows us the first error that it finds, which is in B8. We can left-click Help on this error, which will take us to Online Help. We can left-click Trace Error, which we'll do in a second. We can also left-click Ignore Error, and when we do that, the little green triangle in the upper left-hand corner of the cell that's placed there with the background error checking is cleared. So I'm going to clear that one and go to the next error. And then we have the choice to edit the formula in the formula bar. If the background error checking is something you want to turn off, you can left-click Options and clear the checkbox right next to Enable Background Error Checking. And for that matter, if you don't like the color green, you can change the color to something else. And there's a list of 9 error checking rules that Excel applies when it does the background error checking that you can adjust and customize. This button, Reset Ignored Errors, allows us to reset that little green triangle in the cells with errors. When I left click it, cell B8 gets its triangle back. I'm going to left click OK and then resume, and Excel will go from error to error. I'm going to move the dialog box. Next. And when it completes the check for the entire worksheet, Excel will give us this message: the error check is complete for the entire worksheet. Left-clicking OK. The dialog box closes. What if we want to find the origin of the error for one of these cells? I'm going to make F9 the active cell, and we're going to trace the origin of this error. I can see the cell formula in F9 is referring to D9, so I know the error's origin at least stems that far. I'm going to escape and left-click Trace Error. Excel shows us a series of arrows where F9 is coming from D9 and D9 is coming from B9, which is in turn coming from B8. And then we have a dotted line to something that looks like a little worksheet, because B8, and I'm going to double click this dotted line, is actually coming from 2 cells in this workbook on a different worksheet. Cells C5, which I can select and go to, and C8. So the other one is here. So if you have an error that's displayed in the worksheet, you can use the trace error functionality to trace the references to ultimately determine the origin of that error. And back to the worksheet that contains the errors, you can remove the arrows by left-clicking Remove Arrows. The last thing I want to talk about is circular references. This was actually covered in another movie in a little bit more depth than we're going to cover it here, but it is an error message that you may see, so I want to cover it in the movie that talks about error messages. So what's a circular reference? I want to set up a circular reference by making cell B14 equal to 5 plus the value that's in C14 tab, and C14 is going to be equal to the value that's in B14. Control Enter. And I get a circular reference warning. I'm going to left-click OK. And then Excel displays the references where one cell, in this case C14, is referencing B14, and B14 is in turn referencing cell C14. So there's a resolution to circular references. If they're valid references, you may have just made a mistake and need to correct the references, but if they are valid, go backstage to Alt-F-T to the Formulas area and left-click Enable Iterative Calculation. In this case, I'm going to have it iterate just once instead of 100 times. I'm going to left-click OK. And C14 is now 5 because Excel allowed a calculation to take place in both cells B14 and C14. So C14 picked up the value that was in B14, which was 5 at the time that I performed the iteration. Pressing F2, Control, Enter, every time we recalculate this cell by pressing F2, Control, Enter, Excel iterates once and adds 5 to the value in B14, and then C14 picks up that value. So those cells will always be equal, F2, Control, Enter, and every time I iterate, Excel will add 5 to B14. I'm going to go back to the backstage area again, Alt-FT, and this time set the iteration to 10. Left-clicking OK. And now Excel adds 50 because it's iterating 10 times, and each time it iterates, it's adding 5 to the total that's in cell B14, and then C14 picks up that value. So F2, Control, Enter, it's now 115. It'll become 165 with the next iteration. So if you have a circular reference that's a valid reference, you can have Excel utilize that circular reference to determine the values in the cells that are referencing each other. So that's error checking. We had Excel look in our worksheet, beginning from our active cell, to find errors that were contained on the worksheet. And when it does, it gives us an option to get some help, to trace the error, ignore the error, or edit it in the formula bar. And it also provides access to the background error checking options. We can then move from error to error until we cover the entire worksheet. And when we trace the error, Excel displays a series of arrows that allows us to determine the origin of that error. And when we have a circular reference where we have 2 or more cells that are referencing each other, we can turn on the iterative functionality and have Excel calculate those cells in spite of the circular reference.